What happens when a legendary martial artist and Hollywood icon sits down for what should be a routine late-night interview, only to discover the host has prepared an ambush designed to humiliate him on national television? Tonight, we dive into the explosive confrontation that had security rushing onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live set, and why Chuck Norris walked away from what became the most controversial interview in late-night history. This is a story about respect, dignity, and what happens when a talk show host crosses a line that should never be crossed. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about late-night television. Chuck Norris walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage with his characteristic calm confidence, the kind that comes from decades of martial arts discipline and Hollywood success. The audience erupted in applause, genuinely excited to see the action star who had become a cultural phenomenon. He settled into the guest chair, straightening his jacket with military precision. "Chuck Norris, everybody," Jimmy said, his trademark grin spreading across his face. "Thanks for being here, Chuck." "Thanks for having me, Jimmy," Chuck replied, his voice steady and respectful. "So, Chuck, I have to ask," Jimmy began, leaning forward with an expression that seemed friendly but carried an undertone Chuck couldn't quite place. "You know, there are all these Chuck Norris facts floating around. The internet. Things like Chuck Norris counted to infinity twice, or Chuck Norris can divide by 0. What do you think about becoming this internet meme?" Chuck nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Jimmy, I think it's flattering that people have had fun with my image. Some of them are pretty creative. My family gets a kick out of them." "Right." "Right," Jimmy said, but his smile had taken on a different quality. "But here's what I'm curious about. Do you ever worry that these jokes have kind of turned you into a parody of yourself? I mean, when was the last time you actually did anything that lived up to the Chuck Norris legend?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Chuck's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening that anyone who knew martial arts would recognize as a readiness position. "I'm not sure I understand the question, Jimmy," Chuck said evenly. "Well, I mean," Jimmy continued, his voice taking on a mock-innocent tone, "you're famous for being this tough guy, but you're, 80 years old now? You do infomercials for exercise equipment. You haven't made a real movie in years. Don't you think maybe it's time to admit that the Chuck Norris mystique is just that? A mystique?" The audience had gone noticeably quieter. Chuck studied Jimmy's face for a long moment before responding. "Jimmy, I've had a long career doing what I love. I've been blessed to entertain people, to teach martial arts, and to serve my country. I don't feel the need to prove anything to anyone at this stage of my life." "But that's just it," Jimmy pressed. And now his tone was openly confrontational. "You've built this whole persona around being unbeatable, invincible. But what have you actually accomplished that's so special? I mean, Bruce Lee was a philosopher and revolutionized martial arts. Jackie Chan does his own stunts well into his 60s. Steven Seagal. Well, okay. Maybe Steven Seagal isn't the best example." The audience laughed nervously at Jimmy's aside, but Chuck wasn't smiling. "What exactly are you trying to get at here, Jimmy?" Chuck asked, his voice still controlled, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "I'm just saying," Jimmy continued, spreading his hands as if he were being reasonable. "Maybe it's time for an honest conversation about the gap between the Chuck Norris legend and the Chuck Norris reality. I mean, you were a middling action star in the 80s and 90s. You did some TV. You won some karate tournaments back in the day, but somehow you've become this mythical figure, and I'm wondering if you've started believing your own hype." Chuck was quiet for several seconds, and the studio audience seemed to sense that something had fundamentally changed in the atmosphere. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but it carried more weight. "Jimmy, I came here tonight to have a conversation with you about my career, my family, maybe share some stories with your audience. I didn't come here to be disrespected." "Disrespected?" Jimmy laughed, but it sounded forced. "Now, Chuck, I'm just asking questions. Isn't that what interviews are for? Or do you only do interviews where people kiss your ring and pretend you're actually superhuman? There's a difference between asking questions and trying to tear someone down for your own entertainment, Chuck replied, his martial arts training evident in how completely still he had become. What you're doing right now, this isn't journalism. This isn't even good television. This is just mean-spirited. Jimmy's grin was becoming increasingly artificial. Oh, come on, Chuck. You can't handle a little tough questioning. What happened? To the guy who's supposed to be tougher than nails? Are you going to cry? Should I get you a tissue? The mockery in Jimmy's voice was unmistakable now, and several audience members actually gasped. Chuck slowly turned to look directly at Jimmy. And for the first time since the interview began, Jimmy seemed to realize he might have pushed too far. "You know what, Jimmy?" Chuck said, his voice perfectly calm but carrying an unmistakable note of finality. "I've been in this business for over 40 years. I've worked with professionals and I've worked with amateurs. I've been interviewed by journalists who ask tough questions because they want to inform their audience. And I've been interviewed by people who ask tough questions because they want to make themselves look clever at their guests' expense. And which one am I?" Jimmy asked, but his cockiness was starting to crack. "You tell me," Chuck replied. "Is this how you treat all your guests, or did you decide to make an exception for me tonight?" The tension in the studio was palpable now. Even the band seemed uncomfortable, and the audience had gone almost completely silent. Sensing they were witnessing something that had gone far beyond typical late-night banter, Jimmy shifted uncomfortably. In his chair, realizing the interview had taken a turn he hadn't fully anticipated, but instead of backing down, he doubled down, his ego apparently unable to let Chuck have the last word. "Look, Chuck," Jimmy said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "I think you're being a little sensitive here. This is comedy. This is what we do. We poke fun. We ask the hard questions. We keep things interesting. Maybe you're just not used to being challenged." Chuck's eyes narrowed slightly. "Challenged? Jimmy, I've been challenged by opponents in the ring who could break bones with their bare hands. I've been challenged by directors who demanded perfection in dangerous stunts. I've been challenged by life in ways you probably can't imagine. What you're doing isn't challenging me. You're trying to humiliate me for cheap laughs." "Humiliate you?" Jimmy scoffed. "Come on, Chuck. You're a public figure. You've made millions off this tough guy image. Don't you think the public deserves to know what's behind the curtain? I mean, let's be honest here. When was the last time you were in a real fight? And I don't mean some choreographed movie scene or exhibition match. I'm talking about a real fight." The question was clearly designed to provoke, and Chuck recognized it for what it was. His voice remained steady, but there was steel in it now. "Are you asking me to prove something to you, Jimmy? Because if that's what this is about, we can settle this right here and right now." The audience let out a collective gasp, and Jimmy's eyes widened. For a moment, the host seemed to realize he was no longer in control of the situation. Whoa, Chuck," Jimmy said, raising his hands and forcing a laugh. "I'm not trying to fight you. I'm just saying maybe it's time to admit that the whole Chuck Norris mystique is just marketing, just show business. There's nothing wrong with that. Most of Hollywood is smoke and mirrors." "So, you think I'm all smoke and mirrors?" Chuck asked quietly. "I think you're a smart businessman who figured out how to turn a modest martial arts career into a brand," Jimmy replied, his confidence returning as he felt he was back on safer ground. "And, hey, more power to you, but let's not pretend you're actually the superhero these internet memes make you out to be." Chuck was silent for a long moment, studying Jimmy with the kind of intense focus that had served him well in countless competitions. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "Jimmy, let me ask you something. Do you know what respect means?" "Of course I know what respect means," Jimmy said dismissively. "I don't think you do," Chuck continued. "Because if you did, you'd understand that respect isn't something you earn just by having a television show. It's something you show to other people, especially when they're guests in your house." "This is my show, Chuck," Jimmy shot back, his facade of friendliness completely gone now. "This is my house, and I'll ask whatever questions I want to ask. If you don't like it, you're welcome to leave. Is that what you want? You want me to leave? I want you to answer my questions honestly instead of hiding behind this mystical warrior routine, Jimmy said, leaning forward aggressively. I want you to admit that Chuck Norris, the legend, is just a character you play, and Chuck Norris, the man, is just another aging actor trying to stay relevant. The silence that followed was deafening. Chuck looked at Jimmy for what felt like an eternity, then slowly stood up from his chair. The movement was so fluid and controlled that it seemed almost choreographed, but everyone in the studio could sense the coiled power behind it. You know what, Jimmy? Chuck said, his voice carrying throughout the now completely silent studio. You're right about one thing. Chuck Norris the legend is different from Chuck Norris the man. The legend never gets angry. The legend never loses his temper. The legend always stays calm and collected no matter what. Jimmy swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of how much larger Chuck seemed now that he was standing. But Chuck Norris, the man, Chuck continued, Chuck Norris, the man, has spent his entire life learning discipline, respect, and honor. And Chuck Norris, the man, doesn't appreciate being insulted by someone who thinks having a late-night talk show makes him tough. Chuck, sit down, Jimmy said, trying to inject authority into his voice, but failing. You're making this awkward for everyone. I'm making this awkward. Chuck laughed, but there was no humor in it. Jimmy, you invited me here as your guest, then spent the entire time trying to tear me down. You've been disrespectful, unprofessional, and frankly embarrassing. And now you want to tell me I'm making things awkward. Look, if you can't handle a little ribbing, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews, Jimmy said, but his voice had lost most of its conviction. A little ribbing, Chuck repeated. Jimmy, there's a difference between playful banter and what you've been doing tonight. What you've been doing is trying to humiliate a guest for your own entertainment. And the worst part is you seem to think you're entitled to do it just because this is your show. Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, but Chuck wasn't finished. Let me tell you something about respect, Jimmy. In martial arts, we have a concept called honor. It means you treat your opponents with dignity, even when you're fighting them. It means you don't try to win by tearing the other person down. You try to win by building yourself up. But you wouldn't understand that, would you? Because everything about this, Chuck gestured around the studio, is about tearing people down for laughs. This is entertainment, Chuck, Jimmy said weakly. People tune in to see celebrities get grilled. It's what they expect. No, Jimmy, Chuck said, shaking his head. This is bullying. And the fact that you can't see the difference tells me everything I need to know about your character. The camera operators were clearly unsure whether to keep rolling, and the audience sat in, stunned silence as the confrontation escalated beyond anything they had expected from a typical late-night interview. Jimmy's face had gone pale, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. He forced a nervous laugh and looked toward his audience as if seeking support. Okay, Chuck, I think you're overreacting here, Jimmy said, trying to regain some semblance of control. This is how late-night television works. We joke around. We have fun. We don't take everything so seriously. Maybe you've been out of show business too long and you've forgotten how this works. Chuck took a step closer to Jimmy's desk and the host instinctively leaned back in his chair. Let me make something very clear to you, Jimmy, Chuck said, his voice low and measured. I haven't forgotten anything about show business. I remember when entertainers had class. I remember when hosts treated their guests with basic human decency. What I'm seeing here tonight isn't show business. It's a sad little man trying to build himself up by tearing others down. Now, wait just a minute, Jimmy said, his voice rising. As his own anger finally began to show, you don't get to come on my show and lecture me about how to do my job. I've been doing this for years. I've interviewed everyone from presidents to pop stars, and they all understood that this comes with the territory. The territory? Chuck repeated, his eyebrows raising. What territory is that, Jimmy? The territory where you get to be a bully. Because you have a microphone. The territory where you get to insult people because they're sitting in the guest chair. I'm not insulting you. I'm asking legitimate questions about your career and your image, Jimmy protested. But his voice lacked conviction. No, Jimmy, you're not asking legitimate questions. You want to know what a legitimate question sounds like? A legitimate question would be, Chuck, how did you transition from martial arts, competition to Hollywood? Or, Chuck, what advice would you give to young martial artists starting out? Or even, Chuck, how do you feel about the internet memes that have been created about you? Chuck paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. But that's not what you asked, is it? Instead, you questioned my accomplishments. You mocked my age. You suggested I was a fraud, and you tried to go me into proving myself to you like some kind of trained animal. That's not journalism, Jimmy. That's harassment. Jimmy's producer was frantically gesturing from off stage, clearly trying to signal that this had gone too far, but Jimmy seemed oblivious to everything except his wounded pride. Look, Chuck, if you can't handle the heat, get out of the kitchen, Jimmy said, falling back on a cliché. This is television. This is entertainment. If you wanted to be treated with kid gloves, you should have done the interview with Ellen. The mention of Ellen seemed to be the final straw for Chuck. His expression hardened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that comes from decades of discipline and self-control. You know what, Jimmy? You're absolutely right. If I wanted to be treated with respect, I should have gone somewhere else because clearly respect is something you don't understand and don't practice. Chuck began removing his microphone, his movements deliberate and controlled. Whoa, Chuck, what are you doing? Jimmy asked, suddenly realizing that his guest was preparing to leave. I'm doing what I should have done 10 minutes ago, Chuck replied, calmly. I'm removing myself from this toxic situation. You can't just leave in the middle of an interview, Jimmy said, panic creeping into his voice as he realized his show was falling apart on live television. Watch me, Chuck said simply. Chuck, come on. Don't be so sensitive, Jimmy pleaded. But it was too late. We're just having a conversation here. This is good television. Chuck turned to face Jimmy one final time, and his expression was one of complete disappointment rather than anger. Jimmy, this isn't good television. This is a train wreck. And the saddest part is you don't even see it. You think humiliating your guests makes you clever, but all it does is make you look small. Small. Jimmy's voice cracked slightly on the word small. Chuck confirmed. Small and insecure and desperate for attention. You know, I've met a lot of people in my life, Jimmy. I've met heroes and I've met cowards. I've met champions and I've met cheaters. But I don't think I've ever met someone who was so desperate to prove they were tough that they'd attack a guest on their own show. Jimmy stood up from behind his desk, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. You think you're better than me? Jimmy shouted. You think because you know karate, you can come on my show and disrespect me? I don't think I'm better than you, Jimmy, Chuck said sadly. I just think I'm better than this. At that moment, security personnel began moving toward the stage, clearly having been summoned by the increasingly frantic producers. But Chuck raised his hand, stopping them in their tracks. There's no need for security, Chuck said calmly. I'm leaving voluntarily. Unlike some people, I know when to walk away. Fine, go ahead and leave, Jimmy said, his voice shaking with humiliation. Run away like the coward you really are. Chuck paused at the edge of the stage and turned back one final time. The studio was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Jimmy, Chuck said, his voice carrying easily throughout the silent studio. I've been called many things in my life. I've been called tough. I've been called disciplined. I've been called determined. I've also been called stubborn, demanding, and sometimes difficult to work with. But in 40 years in show business until tonight, I had never been called a coward. Congratulations, you managed to be the first. With that, Chuck Norris walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live stage, leaving behind a host whose face had gone completely white, an audience sitting in stunned silence, and a television moment that would be talked about for years to come. Jimmy stood behind his desk, microphone in hand, clearly having no idea how to recover from what had just happened. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of his humiliation as he realized that his attempt to embarrass Chuck Norris had backfired spectacularly. "Well," Jimmy finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper, "I guess that's a Chuck Norris, everybody." But the damage was done. The interview that was supposed to showcase Jimmy's wit and interviewing skills had instead revealed him to be exactly what Chuck had called him, a bully who had finally picked on the wrong person. And that's the story of how Chuck Norris was kicked off Jimmy Kimmel's show. Except he wasn't kicked off at all. He walked off with his dignity intact, leaving Jimmy to face the consequences of his own poor judgment. What do you think? Did Chuck handle this situation the right way, or should he have stayed and continued the fight? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more stories like this one.